So Dr. Lisa Dive, who's talking with us today, she is a research fellow in bioethics and she works at Sydney Health Ethics, which is based at the University of Sydney. And she has a background in analytic philosophy and health policy. And her research focuses on bioethical concepts and how they come under pressure in the context of complex ethical challenges that arise in healthcare. So Lisa will be, her talk is titled Global Biobank Networks, Ethical Considerations and Responses. And I think Lisa's going to be talking about some work that she conducted with a number of her team members that are shown on the first slide from Sydney Health Ethics. And I think, Lisa, this work was funded by the NHMRC.
Yes, that right? That's right. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So, look, Lisa, I'll invite you to, give your talk. And as I've indicated, we're very happy for people to pop some questions in the chat, and we can ask those at the end, or people, I think, can just come off mute at the end and ask questions. And we're anticipating having lots of time for discussion. So certainly, think about what you'd like to ask at the end, and we look forward to that discussion. But thanks again, Lisa, for giving us your time and telling us about your research.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so I'll start by just orienting you a little bit to the talk that I'll give. It is, as you said, about an NHMRC funded project that I was fortunate to be part of the project team on. So here listed on this slide are some of my colleagues who contributed to the research that I'll be presenting, particularly today. Ian Kerridge and Wendy Lipworth were the leaders of this grant. Just to give you an overview of my talk, and as Jennifer said, there will be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So I'm certainly not going to talk for a whole hour, probably about half an hour maybe. So first, I'll give a bit of an overview of the project that I was a part of, and then I'll talk more generally about the ethical challenges associated with global biobank networking, which were a big part of the motivation for this project. I'll present some of the findings, so there'll be a few slides of data and supplemented with some qualitative findings around a particular focus that I have for this talk, which is the concept of trust. So then after presenting some of those findings, I'll talk a bit more about the concept of trust generally and related to our findings. And then from that, I'll draw out some of the how we've sort of responded to that in our research. Okay, just to start with a bit of an overview of this project, I'm sure everyone here knows what a biobank is, but just to flag that for our purposes for this project, we drew the net very widely on what counts as a biobank. So we took the Parodi definition from a 2015 paper of structured collections of biobank samples and associated data stored for the purposes of present and future research. And we note here that we are not restricted only to collections of samples. We also took it to be data extracted from those samples. So a very wide definition of what a biobank is. Now, in terms of the networking practices of biobanks, so this project was prompted by the recognition of the ethical complexity that arises when biobanks form networks across international borders. And I'll just, in the following section, I'll give a little bit of an overview of some of the ethical considerations that arise in that context. But just first to run through why biobanks might want to form networks. Again, I'll skip through this quite quickly because I'm sure it's fairly familiar to many of you who are involved in biobanking. So where a biobank might be originally housed within a single institution within national borders, there are benefits to forming networks between biobanks in terms of sharing expertise, and particularly across international borders, the consortia form to enable sort of international expertise to come to bear on a particular research question or to a field of research. And there are many other reasons as well that things like sustainability, viability, both in terms of infrastructure as well as financial viability, is a big reason why a single institution biobank might not be as feasible as one that is networked across maybe different sites and different institutions, where they can sort of have different aspects or different sort of functions of a biobank network housed within different institutions. This can make them more sustainable. Also, sometimes the regulatory requirements for clinical trials require biobanks or biobank-based research to include data from ethnically diverse populations, and so connecting together with other biobanks in other parts of the world can be a way of achieving those regulatory requirements. And finally, allowing the standardization of operations and governance is another benefit, a reason why biobanks might form networks, particularly over international borders. This project that I worked on was an NHMRC funded project that ran from 2016 to 2019, entitled Biobank Networks, Medical Research and the Challenge of Globalization. So this project brought together experts in ethics and also sociology, Indigenous health research and social psychology, and it was spread across 4 institutions. It was mostly housed at Sydney University. We conducted most of the research there, but we had partners at ANU, Swinburne and Deakin who took on particular aspects of the project. The purpose of this research project was to inform the development of ethically rigorous and also culturally informed strategies. So it had quite a practical orientation to think about what Australian biobanks can do, or to understand better how Australian biobanks contribute to and benefit from international biobank networks, and then also to think about the practical ways that they can sort of elaborate their policies and practices to participate in biobank networks more effectively and upholding the highest ethical standards. So the specific research questions that we looked at was, how and why do Australian biobanks contribute to and use global biobank networks? So this is about understanding the practices of Australian biobanks. The other question, the next question was about the regulatory environment, both within Australia and internationally. So we had a panel of legal experts to help inform this aspect of the project that we brought together, and to look at this question quite broadly and the impact of those regulations on biobank networking practices. We were interested in the attitudes of various stakeholders, and these include people who run biobanks and work in them, researchers, legal scholars, as well as the general public in Australia. So that was a significant component of this project as well. And because the general public obviously is potential donors to Australian biobanks. And then we wanted to also consider what were the persisting and emerging legal and socio-cultural challenges that were raised by biobank networking practices. So this brings together both the empirical research that we conducted and also theoretical, ethical and sociological analysis. The way that the project was run, it was an empirical mixed methods project. So it included an audit of biobank policies and practices across Australia, as well as interviews with a selection of people who have various roles within Australian biobanks. There was a legal and regulatory analysis supplemented by that panel of legal experts who spent a day discussing some of these issues, and we've drawn all that together into a paper as well. A big part of the project was a study of knowledge and attitudes via stakeholder surveys. So this had various components. It included a large survey of the Australian public, and supplemented again with qualitative interviews, as well as an Indigenous community consultation aspect or component to this project. And then the fourth component was strategy development and dissemination. And all of these branches of the empirical study were supplemented with theoretical research based on ethical, philosophical and sociological analysis. So just now, to expand a little bit on the rationale or the motivation for this project, I'll just highlight some of the main ethical challenges that arise from the formation of biobank networks across international borders. So clearly when a bunch of human biological samples are collected together in a biobank, this practice already raises some significant ethical issues that we have to pay attention to. So in taking tissue samples from donors, a biobank accepts certain obligations to those donors. So these include obtaining appropriate consent, maintaining the privacy of donors, and sometimes there might be some obligation to share the benefits of research with participants. And then on the other side, biobank donors might also have some concerns about what the biobank does with their sample or data. So custodianship of tissue can be a complex ethical issue, and particularly for certain population groups that can be a more significant issue than for others. Donors might also have concerns about commercial involvement and the potential for commercial entities to make profits using their research that uses their samples. And there can also be some expectations sometimes about return of results or findings based on their sample. So if we start with all of these ethical issues, then they become significantly more complex when the research is globalized and tissue is shared across international borders. So there are some new ethical issues arise as research is globalized, and these relate particularly to the potential for exploitation of vulnerable populations, and also the potential for such research to magnify existing inequities between different communities and different countries. Something else that really came out in our ethical analysis of this kind of research is that trust is a concept that emerged both in the literature and from our data. And I'll come back to that a little bit later, but here what I'll just say is that trust is a factor which is essential for biobanking research, and it's very subject to being influenced by the way that global networking is done. So now I will go through a few of our findings. I'll focus on the findings from the survey of and the qualitative study of attitudes among the Australian public. And so this is to help understand how our research is helping to inform responses to this ethical complexity. And the findings that I have drawn out here that I'll focus on today are those that indicate how trust operates in this context. So I'll draw primarily on data from our survey and interviews of the Australian public, as I said. And just to show you, here I'll just set out the kinds of questions that I've focused on. So the first set of questions are about willingness to participate, because we consider that the general public's willingness to donate to a biobank is an indicator of trust. It reflects their trust in the enterprise of biobank research generally. The second issue that I'll focus on in the findings is about identifiability of samples, so people's preferences with how identifiable their sample is. And this has to do with the amount of personal information that is attached to the sample. And this we also consider to be an indicator of trust, because the more when a person is not very concerned about their information going with their sample and being used in research, then that shows that they're not that concerned that their sample will be used in ways that don't align with their values. So it's another way of indicating their trust in the research that will be done with their sample. And the third kind of category of finding that I'll look at is about consent preferences. So the kind of consent that donors prefer to have when they give a sample, we think that that can also be read as an indicator of trust, because the broader or more open the consent that people are comfortable with, that indicates the less control that they wish to have over their sample. And so that's also a reflection of the degree of trust that they have in the biobank. So I'll run through some findings in these three categories, and then after that I'll draw together what we can learn from them. Just a little bit more information about the survey and the way it was done. I'm happy to answer more questions about this if you're interested in the methods afterwards as well. So there were two components to the survey of the Australian, or to the research on attitudes of the Australian public. So there was a large quantitative survey run out of Swinburne, which asked 750 Australians about their attitudes to biobanking. And So there were 48 questions. It used a methodology called computer-assisted telephone interviewing, and it covered a lot of topics in relation to biobanks and globalization. And then this was supplemented by qualitative interviews. There were follow-up interviews with people who had already participated in the quantitative survey. So I'll draw on findings from both of these phases of our study. So I know these slides are a little bit busy, the results slides, but I'll step through them and explain what they mean. So this first one, this is a question about willingness, and it shows what we take from this question is that the location of a biobank is a significant factor in how willing people would be to donate a sample. So what we've got here is participants were asked about their willingness to donate tissue to local biobanks versus international biobanks. And then there's a couple of levels in between. So the bottom cluster of findings here are the answers about Australian biobanks. The top one is about biobanks located entirely overseas. And then the middle two clusters here are about Australian biobanks that either send their samples overseas or allow some of their either send their samples overseas to be used by overseas researchers or send their samples overseas to be stored in a biobank that's located outside of Australia. So what we can see here is that there's a very clear preference or a greater comfort level. The blue bars there are the yes answers, which indicate willingness to donate. People have, we had 94% of participants who were willing to donate to an Australian biobank, and only 4% were not willing to. So that's this bottom cluster of findings here. And then we can contrast that with the overseas biobanks. Only 63% of participants were willing to donate to an international biobank, and 33% were not willing to donate there. And we can also see here that the orange bars here, the proportion of unsure responses increased quite substantially as the biobanks started sending samples overseas or were located entirely overseas. So the findings that we took from this was that sending samples overseas or storing them or giving them to overseas biobanks significantly reduces people's willingness to donate, so their comfort and trust with donating to a biobank. These findings were supported with our qualitative follow-up interviews as well. So I'll just give an example of, these are actual quotes from interview participants, interviewees, that illustrate particular attitudes that were quite representative. So there was a lot of general support for medical research, and people on the whole supported donating to biobanks and donating for the benefit of medical research broadly. So they said things like, I'd probably be okay with it as long as the purpose is kind of still good. There was quite a significant concern about commercialization expressed by many participants. So they said things like, I'd probably be more inclined or trusting something like a university or a not-for-profit. And there were also attitudes of concern expressed about globalization, people saying things like, I dislike the idea of other countries mooching off us and then making a profit. So that's about the attitudes and some of the concerns that, as well as the biobank being located overseas, some of the concerns in relation to that sort of tampered back people's willingness to donate. Next, I'll look at privacy and identification of samples. So again, this is a little bit of a complicated slide. I'll step through it. So what we asked people here, there were 3 options. We asked about their preferences for identification of their samples if they were going to be donating to a biobank. So there were 3 options for identifiability. So coded means biological samples are given a code so that the researchers do not know who you are, but can link back to other information for research purposes. And so there are protections in place, but there's a very small risk of loss of confidentiality. That's this bottom section here. Anonymous samples are when the biobank stores the sample completely anonymously. So it's been de-identified entirely so that no one is able to work out who had donated the sample. And then identifiable samples are when they're stored together with the some identifying information about the donor. And so we asked whether they would prefer, which of these types of consent they would prefer if they were to donate to an Australian biobank as opposed to an overseas biobank. And what we see here is a significant difference depending on whether the biobank is in Australia or overseas, and that people are much more comfortable with their sample being identifiable if it stays in Australia. So here we've got the blue lines that indicate yes. So you can see in each of these three sections, or in all of the sections really, but particularly the identifiable section, there's a much greater comfort level. That's what I'm comparing here, if the biobank is in Australia compared to overseas. So here, to give you a few figures against this one, so because we had 66% of people were prepared to have an identifiable sample used in Australia, that's this one here, compared to only 42% if it was going to be used overseas. And another way of looking at this is comparing people's preferences about anonymous samples against what is acceptable for identifiable samples. So 54% of survey respondents said no to allowing their identifiable sample to be used overseas. That's this one here, compared to only 22% saying no to it going overseas if their sample was used and stored anonymously. So if it's going to go overseas, there's a very strong preference for their personal information not going with that sample. So we can see there's a real reluctance here for biobank donors to allow their personal data to travel with their samples overseas, which shows that when biobanks engage in global networking, they're perceived as less trustworthy to some extent. But still, as we saw in relation to consent, we still have people with very generally positive attitudes to allowing their sample to be used and stored in a biobank, and that attitude remains the majority view. So still you can see in almost all cases the blue lines are longer than the orange lines, so except for when it's identifiable samples going overseas. So there's still general support for participation. And these attitudes were also reflected in the qualitative interviews. So there's still this generally supportive attitude, but globalization is a concern. People said things like, I don't really want my name put on these sorts of things. It's just the privacy thing. This quote shows the supportiveness of medical research enterprise more generally, and a lot of people just didn't want to know about it afterwards. I just want to give my sample and be done with it. But particularly when we started talking about sending samples to other biobanks and to other countries, governance and ethical oversight became a lot more important. So people said things like, I'd like to know that it was a fairly rigorous protocol that was in place. So finally, the third sort of grouping of findings from our survey, from our study, is this is the question about preferences regarding consent. So people were asked what kind of consent they would be comfortable with if they donated their tissue to different kinds of biobanks. So here again we have the left cluster here is a biobank located entirely in Australia, and the far right here is an overseas biobank. And then we have an Australian biobank that shares samples or data with overseas researchers, or an Australian biobank that stores their samples overseas. Now, I'll just read you through the definitions of consent that people were offered. Remember, this was a telephone survey of the Australian public, so we had some simple explanations of different levels of consent, and then they were asked about their preferences. So no consent here means that they would not give consent for their sample to be used for any research study, and that did increase as the biobanks moved overseas, but it was still the smallest proportion. Specific consent is where you would like to be asked permission before each new study that uses your tissue sample. Conditional consent is where you'd want to give consent for certain kinds of studies, but not for others. So that would probably be given in advance. And then broad consent is where you would consent just once for your sample to be used for any future projects that are approved by an ethics committee. And if we look here at the percentage of respondents who have a preference for broad consent, which this is generally considered the most effective for enabling future research, this is the yellow bars here, we had 52% of people preferring to give broad consent to an Australian biobank, but only 36% would give broad consent to an overseas biobank. And then if we include conditional consent in those figures, we have 77% of respondents preferring either broad or conditional consent for an Australian biobank, compared to 58% for an overseas biobank. So we see that people seem less comfortable with relinquishing control over their sample once it starts to move out of the country. So they're more comfortable relinquishing that control if the sample stays in Australia. And here again, we note that while the proportions change, there is still a clear preference for broad consent in general. So we have that prevailing kind of confidence and trust in the enterprise of medical research generally still coming through here. So broad consent was still considered fairly acceptable, but we found that governance matters a lot more and that ethical oversight when biobanks form global networks. So a similar kind of quote to the one I showed previously, people said things like, I would need to know that all the protocols were absolutely spot on before I'd like it to go to another country. So those are the findings that I've talked about for today, and I'm just going to relate those findings a little bit to some of the theory about the concept of trust, which we sort of supplemented with sort of theoretical conceptual research from bioethics literature. And I'll relate that, then connect that theory with our findings from this study. So trust is a really essential precondition for biobank research, because without it, people wouldn't donate samples at all. It also increases the likelihood, if people are trusting of the biobank, then it increases the likelihood that they'll donate with broad consent, which is it's quite an effective enabler of future research and more diverse kinds of research, and also lets researchers be more nimble in the sense they don't need to go back and seek sort of specific consent for each project that they want to do. And also trust is really important. Public trust affects biobank sustainability, in particularly from the funding perspective. Trust as a concept, though, is really hard to define and pin down. It is discussed in the literature in various ways, but some of the more interesting things that I've found about trust is that it's related very much to the concept of trustworthiness. And we can understand trust to be a belief that another party is going to be competent, that they have the ability to follow through, and that they are likely to follow through on what we're trusting them to do. So if we think about this for the purposes of our research about biobanks, something that's quite important is the difference between interpersonal trust and institutional trust. So I found it really interesting that in the philosophical literature about trust, it almost exclusively focuses on trust between two people, so interpersonal trust. But institutional trust is explored much more in psychological studies, so empirical studies of the way that people's trust functions. So we've tried to draw those together, and something that we think is really important is how we shift from interpersonal to institutional trust. That's something that's relevant for biobanking, and also the concept of transitivity, which I'll just explain here. I've got a little example that's like sort of an illustration to explain what I mean by transitivity of trust. It's the idea that the trust that we have in one person or institution then transfers through to another. So here we have person A, and we have person B. So person A trusts person B, who might be their clinician, or it could be a lab technician. And they trust that person because of the relationship that they have with them, the credentials that they have, and it might also be related, the trust might also be related to the institution that person B works for. I'm going to call that institution C. So this lends some institutional trust that person A has in person B to that institution. That trust flows on and is transitive through that person that they have a relationship, a trusting relationship with, onto the institution. So what we're particularly interested in is how that trust then flows on through a global network of biobank institutions, as institution C forms a network with maybe one other institution and then maybe a whole global network. So in our empirical research, we're looking for what biobanks can do in terms of the way that they form their networks, the arrangements that they put in place, the governance arrangements. How can they do that in a way that maximizes the transitivity of trust, so that this trust over here that the person has in the individual and the institution that they're dealing with, so that it flows on and transfers to the wider network? So this is the question that I'll consider just briefly in my responses sections. So the main findings that relate to public trust in biobanking were that there is generally broad support for biobank research, but there are some concerns around globalization and the involvement of commercial entities who might be seeking to make a profit above other considerations. But also something that came through strongly in our research is that ethical oversight and good governance protocols can really, good sort of research governance can really mitigate those concerns. So our preliminary recommendations coming out of this project would be that biobanks which network globally should really maintain that focus on trust and think about what they can do to foster trustworthiness, and particularly paying attention to the way that governance of such networking arrangements really matters a lot if we're concerned about public trust, which is something that we think we should be concerned with. So what that ethical governance actually looks like would be the next question. And another phase of our project closely examined biobanking practices, including governance, and we're currently drawing, or some work is underway to draw that together with reflections from a panel of legal experts to set out a bit more specific guidance about how those ethical governance arrangements can be made the most robust and transparent in order to foster public trust in global biobank networks. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to just acknowledge my colleagues here on the research team, and I have some references I'm happy to circulate afterwards. But that's it from me for now, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Lisa. That was really great. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to hang on. We've got a bit of echo. I'm just wondering whether Lisa, do you want to mute just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Just for 1 sec. How's that now? Yes, that's better. So I think if everyone can, we'll just have one person talking just because of the echo. Yeah, that was a great talk. I might read the first question in the chat. Comes from Renee Mantle, who works with the biobank. She's our communications manager. So Renee has asked whether the 750 people surveyed in the Swinburne study were given information or resources about biobanks or biobanking before answering questions.
Yeah, sure. So the methodology used for that survey was called a CATI interview technique, which is computer-aided telephone interviewing. It was it's something that centre down at Swinburne specialises in, and it's quite a lengthy interview. Actually, I think it took typically around 45 minutes to do that interview, and so part of the way that it's computer assisted is that there's a script, and so some of the wording that I've sort of paraphrased from it, I don't have the entire script here with me, but there were sort of set plain language descriptions of what a biobank is, what different kinds of consent mean, what it means to form a network, all those kinds of things. So people were given, as part of the interview, they were given some definitions and explanations, and they could be, they had the opportunity to sort of ask questions and so on. And in the follow-up interviews as well, which I was involved in conducting some of those, that was more of a semi-structured interview methodology. So people had the opportunity to ask more follow-up questions, and we had the set definitions, but then we could also give more lengthy explanations if necessary.
Thanks, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another. Lisa, do you want to jump on mute again? Sorry. Can only seem to have. It's a little bit like Lord of the Flies. You know, you can only speak when you've got the shell or something. We've got another question from Jan Mumford, and Jan is asking whether having a health condition influence people's responses, especially in regard to commercialisation. So I guess this is kind of question. Yeah, did you have any ability to know whether the respondents had a health condition or not?
I don't think we asked specifically if they had a health condition, but we did ask them. You know, I was not so closely involved in conducting the quantitative surveys, but certainly in the qualitative interviews, one of the things we asked people was whether they had previously donated to a biobank. So, and then we could explore that, and a lot of people reflected on their experience of donating to a biobank as informing their responses. So it might be, we had some people who had been through cancer treatment or something like that. So they knew that some of their samples which had been removed had gone into biobanks for research purposes as part of that treatment process. Other people were like regular blood donors and things like that. So we asked more about their previous involvement with biobank donation rather than having a health condition specifically. But yeah, no, I don't have, I didn't do the data crunching myself. That's not my area of expertise. So there would be a way of doing that. I'm not sure if that has been pulled out specifically.
Toby, I can see you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thanks. This has been a really very interesting chat, especially as somebody who, you know, is quite often at the heart of client engagement and negotiating between different, I guess, groups of people, stakeholders. I guess my question centers around the trust and transitivity aspect, and particularly when we're talking about, you know, various sociological frameworks that predicate that there needs to be a certain level of vulnerability established to get a true sense of trust between two different groups. And I guess the heart of my question is, can the transitivity principle apply in the opposite fashion? So for instance, can a biobanks association with a particular institution that might be viewed negatively by a particular target cohort negatively impact the ability to recruit or allow people to have that trust established with a person that they're dealing with from any particular biobank? Was there any kind of information that you had on that kind of effect?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Look, no, I don't think our study looked at those kinds of things specifically, but I know certainly when the legal panel got together, a lot of the discussion around the way that human tissue and its movement around the world and the regulations around its storage and use have developed. It's often been quite reactive. So there'll be like a hospital scandal or something like that, which then prompts a whole layer of regulation and legislation to stop something scandalous like that happening again. So that's when you would have an institution where somehow, which has done something, where something has happened, which has caused that institution to lose public trust. And then legislation or regulation of various sorts are often the response to try and rebuild trust. The role of individuals in that would be, I think a lot of trust is held in that clinician or researcher relationship with the individual donor as well. So that could be a source of sort of rebuilding trust after a loss of public trust as well. So, I mean, it's a really interesting question. There's a lot there. But I think regulation as well is quite important in there in relation to responding to loss of trust.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Lisa, I've got another question here in the chat from Candice Carter at the Biobank. So Candice is asking, I think it's a very good question about, when you're asking people about the type of consent that they preferred, were they sort of informed about the consequences of exercising that preference? So for example, if participants need to be consented for each individual project, are they made aware that basically that's going to cost money in some way, and and for example, that approach of reconsent may mean that there is actually less funding available for collecting future samples or laboratory research. Was that something that was included in the survey?
Again, I don't have the exact questions here, but I don't think so, no. I think it was more just getting to their attitudes about what kind of consent they preferred, and the cost of research and the cost of future consent didn't so much come into it. Yeah,
it is I think an issue that sort of faces people at the coalface. Often, we're often engaged in discussions around, preferences of consent, but sometimes at the biobank here, we also have to think about what's the impact of that on our ability to deliver those services.
Yeah, and that also goes to the sustainability of biobank.
Yeah, that's right.
Generally, yeah. Mm.
Okay, we have another question from Amanda Rush. Amanda did her PhD at the biobank.
Mm-hmm.
So Amanda's wondering whether you're able to collect data on participant demographics such as age. Is it possible, for example, that older people have less trust in globalisation and commercialisation?
Right. Yes, we do have demographic data. So we had quite a good spread across regional and rural and urban areas, and gender balance and that kind of thing. I don't know the split. I'm pretty sure this would be somewhere in our data. I don't have it to hand, but I know that our sample of participants in the survey was a little bit skewed towards older people generally anyway, particularly in the follow-up interviews, because those are the kinds of people who have 45 minutes to do a telephone interview by and large. But yeah, no, sorry, I don't have the there are quite a few. I mean, based on my experience of doing half of the qualitative interviews, many of the older people, we did do half and half, older and younger survey participants who we recontacted for the interviews. Certainly a lot of the older people who I spoke to were very generally supportive of medical research broadly, and quite a lot of them were like, yeah, happy to give my sample and be done with it kind of thing. So,
do you think that could also reflect, I guess, attitudes to healthcare? Because I know in the past, and I think that's probably still true, older people are often, look, they go to the doctor, they trust the doctor, they don't necessarily want to know what's wrong with them. But people who have been raised sort of in the information age are much more likely to be consulting Dr. Google, to be coming into the doctor's surgery already with some idea of what they think is wrong with them. Do you think that sort of attitudes to trust are influenced by people's expectations around information and their comfort with receiving information?
Yeah, look, I don't know. Yeah, it could well be. I think that, we have different expectations now, certainly in terms of the information that we expect to receive. And some people, but I think it's still I don't know if it's really a generational split. I think there are plenty of older information seekers who are doing all the Googling as well. And there are some younger people who are also very trusting in the medical profession and medical researchers. So I think there's still a good mix, and it's quite a lot of personal preference. It's people are different.
And with the caddy interviews, are they conducted through landlines or are they also mobile phone based?
Mobiles as well. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, because I was thinking
quite a lot of them are mobiles, actually.
Yeah, I think that's probably something that's changed over the years, hasn't it? Because I don't know, but I think years and years ago it would have been landlines, but
yes,
now almost people don't have landlines anymore. So
lots of people don't. Yeah. I don't anymore. So yeah.
Aha, we have another question. So from Genevieve Curry, thank you for the interesting session. What is the extent of Australian biobank participation on the global stage? That's a very good question.
That is a very good question. I don't actually have the data on hand to that at the moment. Basically, the general answer would be not that much. I think there is some, but it would be very ad hoc and sort of individual. I don't think we are that active in participating in the big global consortia that much. But yeah, no, I wasn't actually so close to that phase of the research project. We do have a paper that has come out quite recently I could circulate that goes into in a bit more depth some of the findings from our interviews and surveys of Australian biobanks. So I'm happy to circulate that paper.
Yeah, look, you could pop that, if you've got time, you could pop it in the chat. Is that the light paper, the Edwin Light paper?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we've actually cited that in a manuscript that's in revision, so we know that one.
Oh, okay, great. I can.
Yeah, I don't know, Genevieve, do you want to come off mute and ask, sort of talk about that a bit more, or that's okay? Looks like that's okay. Yeah, I guess, in terms of biobank participation on the global stage, we've probably got to think about the size of Australia versus other countries. We are a small country, in terms of population, and generally I think Australian research tends to sort of punch above its weight. So I tend to agree that I think in terms of sheer numbers, Australian biobanks are probably a minority on the global stage, but possibly relative to our population, we're over contributing. That would be, I think that's generally a feature of Australian medical research. Aha, we have another question from Amanda. Be interesting to see the perspective of people in other countries, e.g. lower, middle, high income, when posed whether they would trust Australian biobanks. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So some of what we looked at in our sort of more theoretical conceptual research was about those kinds of disparities between countries. And there's one paper where we look quite closely at a biobanking partnership with Oxford and a Chinese biobank, and looked at how those, China's not a small country, obviously, but it kind of illustrates the sort of disparities, and looked at some of the practices and how the samples were obtained in sort of rural parts of China, and the way that they were used as part of a global research consortium. And certainly that's an issue in this kind of networking when research is conducted by sort of big institutions from Europe or America often, and then they collect samples and like on the ground in as you said, some smaller or lower middle income countries that are perceived as more vulnerable, and the participants might not quite know what they're getting into. So there's some interesting sociological research on those kinds of factors.
Thank you. I've just realised I've taken up a lot of the chat by putting in more details about your paper.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Do we have any other questions? We've still got a little bit of time. I think if we don't, look, that's been a really, really interesting exploration of some very interesting issues. I'm very interested in that concept of trust as well, because it applies to many, it applies to biobanking, it applies to participants' involvement with biobanking, but also researchers. I think there's some evidence in the literature that researchers probably select biobanks largely driven by trust, as opposed to what biobankers might view as external manifestations of trustworthiness, such as participation in certification programs, you know, reaching certain kinds of professional standards. When you actually ask researchers, what do they value? They value biobanks that they know and trust, often through, you know, interpersonal relationships, as you mentioned. So yeah, trust it's a funny thing, isn't it? We can all think that we know what it is, but when we try and define it, it's actually quite hard to pin down.
It is actually really a difficult concept to pin down. There's some very interesting philosophy writing about the concept of trust, which is
that'd be interesting to know about too. And I think there's also that sort of saying that I don't know how it's true, you know, that once trust is lost, it's very hard to reestablish. Is that something that you think could be true?
I think that is the case, because once a trusting attitude is undermined by something like, you know, the public health scandals and things like that, then it's really hard to claw it back to rebuild that trust. Whereas if it sort of organically grows over time, it's this is where it's that that would be more the social psychological research, which looks at the way that trust operates. There's a body of empirical research that looks at people's attitudes to institutions in terms of trust, and how the factors that can build it up and undermine it. So then pulling that together with the philosophical literature on what actually is trust, what do we mean by it, and how does it work? It's quite interesting.
It is very interesting.
Yeah.
And we have another question from Candice, which was whether participants were asked about participations in, for example, you know, what has been referred to as like recreational genomics, you know, sending samples to Ancestry.com or 23andMe.
Yeah, so we did ask people just if they had donated a sample to any kind of a biological repository. So from memory, I can't remember if anyone mentioned this kind of thing, but it's the kind of thing that came up in some of the qualitative interviews, but it wasn't the main focus.
Sure, because you might imagine that people that were willing to do that kind of thing might be, I don't know, you know, might be a bit more open. They probably weren't in the group that were saying, no, I'm not going to consent, you know, I'm not going to, you know, participate.
Yeah. There's some of my colleagues did a big study on Australian attitudes to that kind of direct-to-consumer genomics. So that's a separate study, but they've had some interesting research outputs too. It's a different kind of a focus.
Fantastic. Well, look, if we don't have any other questions, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. It's a great discussion.
Thank you.
So the talk will be recorded and it'll be available on the Biobank website.